Hey everybody. So today I am just doing a little bit of a first impressions on Saga and discussion about the first game that I ended up having. I've only played one game of Saga so far and actually really did enjoy it quite a bit. What I would actually the interesting thing about the game is that it is produced by Studio Tomahawk, just like Musket and Tomahawks. Another game that they actually do, and for those of you that watch the channel, you know that that's the one that's used for the Black Powder era and sort of North American colonial times. And Saga, I am finding to be very, very different in many respects than Musket and Tomahawks. I had heard, just in forums and things that it was just that it was a different rule set, but I didn't quite realize just how different, and I was a little surprised given, even though it is a different era, historical era, I was surprised just as to how different all of the rules are. One of the things that just struck me when reading the rule book is that essentially your warlord in Saga is technically in many cases, they describe it as being you, even though there are characters that you can take, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Basically, at one point in the rulebook, they say you are the warlord. And so this is sort of like your avatar on the table. Now, it's one thing just to sort of say that, but it's another to sort of have a lot of rules and mechanics in the game that give you that feel. Now, bringing back the contrast to Musket and Tomahawks, in Musket and Tomahawks, you actually create characters, and it's one of the strengths of the game is that you can create individualized officers that have different abilities, traits, and choosing the weapon, just lots of different things, and you essentially create multiple officers, and they're their own individuals, and they can even have different side plots and personality kind of components with their traits that individualize them. And they're not you, they're their own unit that's on the table. And like I said, you can have multiples of them. Now, in Saga, at a very basic level from looking at the rules, you are the warlord, that's you on the table, and when you're trying to activate the units that are in your army or your warband, they're on a battle board, and depending on how experienced those units are, they could require more difficult Saga dice to get in order to control them. And so it just, put in a simple way, it's harder to make your run-of-the-mill levy sort of units, which are like the farmers and citizens that join you. It's harder to get them to do what you want as compared to let's say your Hearthguard or your Huskarls or your more elite units. Now that does seem to make sense, and it is different than Musket and Tomahawks in that you do an action and you do an action depending on what kind of unit it is. It doesn't matter. In this one, it does matter, and the proximity to these units with your warlord can affect that. But even the types of units can make it more difficult to actually get them to do certain things. It's more costly to you in your dice pool. So I'm not really going to do I'm just really going to talk about sort of my first impressions on the game. And the game, many of you may know, the game does use these dice, and so they have different symbols on them. But you'll see, like in the case of the Danes, the helmet is like your number 6, and there's only one of them on each die, and it's the hardest one to get. Whereas the axes are much easier; they're the most common, and then there's only 2 of the horses, and so it's sort of like 4, 2, and 1 as far as the symbols go. And so you need to use these dice in order to actually activate on a battle board, which looks like this. They show the dice next to different abilities. Now, I actually found that it was very interesting reading the book. This idea of the battle board was very interesting. It was almost like there was a little game happening each round before you even moved your men or did anything with your men on the table with the opponent. You literally have to roll a certain number of dice, and then you have to decide where you're going to put them on here. Now, On the left side, you do have ones that are to activate your men. And there are different phases, within the game where you can use these. You can't use them all at any point in the game. So some of these are like during the activation phase where you activate your men. You can't do that late. You don't initiate that later. You have to choose that early on. But then there are some where you can even dedicate a dice to try to roll 2 more dice. And so like this one, the helmet one I mentioned, is a valuable one, and you can actually use it to actually then roll again an extra one and get an extra die. So they're actually, it's almost like a little game within a game. And then it's very strategic because you have to think heavily about what you're going to want to do this round and how you're not going to waste your dice but maximize them. Because you can keep dice too and just roll less later in your next turn, whether you're going to try to keep an ability now to then leave it there when the round's over and know you have it for next round. So it's actually very strategic in my mind. I know all of our war games can be both tactical and strategic depending on how you exactly define that. I found this game more strategic than Musket and Tomahawks, where I found Musket and Tomahawks more tactical. I was sort of looking at, you're looking at the table and looking for a line of sight and trying to really, in Musket and Tomahawks, it's not that movement and positioning isn't important in Saga, from what I can see, but in Musket and Tomahawks, each man in the unit is extremely independent in what it can do, and you can mix up lots of different things to do lots of different tactical scenarios. Whereas in Saga, it's very much the unit. It's not about the man in the unit. And so again, just a very different approach by the same company for its 2 games. It has more games than 2, but just 2 big games that they do. And so, yeah, it was very, very interesting to read the book and then to play the game. Now, one of the things that's also interesting is that the Anglo-Danes that I've chosen to play, they have, each of the armies have special abilities and limitations. Anglo-Danes, for instance, can't take men with javelins. They also can't take cavalry. And they also, like the Warlord, has to use a Dane axe in most situations, unless there's they take a particular hero, which I'll talk about in a moment. And so, right off the bat, mobility-wise, you don't have cavalry. Even they can take levies and use slings and bows, so you can use some ranged. I don't currently have that. But you're limited in using javelins, which operate differently, so you're limited in certain respects. What is interesting is that you can move from taking a generic warlord, like I currently have. I could use this model and use him as a hero within, and they call them heroes of the Viking Age. And so for the Anglo-Danish, one of them is called Canute the Great, first Anglo-Danish king of England. And if you take Canute, all of a sudden you can actually use either the Anglo-Danish, or you can split your dice up and use the Viking battle board, which is very interesting, because now you can operate your army very differently. You do have to split your dice up, kind of half, and so your dice across 2 different boards, but it really changes the number of abilities and how you can operate. So that was very interesting. There are other heroes, and I'm not going to go too much into them, but there is one, and the name escapes me because I don't own any of these yet, some of the extra models. I'll throw his picture up for the video, but he allows you to not only... he allows you to leverage the levy characters more. And you can't take, I believe, the elite characters, the most elite, with him. And you're also allowed to use mercenaries in a way that you normally can't. And so there are mercenaries in the game that you can buy the models for and use. And some of them have limitations. In this case, I think they're the Swiss, or the Swedish, I believe. And I'll correct that if I've got that wrong. But basically, from what I remember, you're not allowed to use battle board abilities with them. Like, they have their own benefits to the unit, and they can be very good, but they actually have limitations, and they're not kind of part of your army in the sense that they don't use the abilities of the battle board. When you use this particular hero, they actually become part of your army, and you can actually use the abilities of the battle board. So it's very interesting. Like, there's lots of ways to change your army up, even though they do each have their own sort of set strengths and weaknesses as a core element. So I found that really interesting. I did play one game, and it was interesting because the gentleman that came over to play the game, he played Irish, and he had won 3 times. He's new to it as well, but he's had a very sort of strong showing with his Irish, and that he had won 3 games already. Now, honestly, I felt that the feel was that he won the game as well, that I played him, although when we counted up the victory points in the end, it was actually a tie. And so it was my first game, and technically I tied him, but in a lot of respects, he had a bigger army than I did, and from a model count perspective, it felt like he won. But it was very, very interesting overall. I tried to play the Anglo-Danes to their strength, which is these guys their big thing is putting fatigue on your enemy, so you're kind of wearing them out. Now, fatigue in the game, you get fatigue tokens for giving various reasons. I mean, you naturally get these tokens that you put. I just have these tokens here that I've purchased, but you actually put them on your unit when they've performed extra actions beyond one action in some cases in a round. It can fatigue them, which makes sense. When you go into melee combat, you also automatically, each side gets a fatigue. Fatigue is spent by your opponent to better themselves from an armor perspective or an attack perspective, or to worsen yourself and your opponent in the same way. And so when you start piling on fatigue, it really makes your units less usable. And the Anglo-Danish battle board abilities add extra fatigue in various ways to your enemy. He had as Irish very interesting abilities. Much of them were around ranged combat, and he even had you have stray arrows coming from different types of rough ground that just attack you even though he doesn't have his models there, and so I lost men that way. So it was very interesting. Overall, brand new game for me, and I was just trying to get my head around it. But I found, as I was talking about with the strategic theme, I found myself really thinking deeply when I was playing this game. Now, it's not that I don't get into the tactical games, whether it be 40K or Musket and Tomahawks or bolt action. I'm thinking the whole time and trying to win and trying to develop strategies and tactics. But in this game, I really felt like I was the warlord there, and as an example, if in the rules, if you move your unit too close to an enemy unit, they will attack the enemy unit. They have to, whether you want them to or not. And it shows how your ability to direct them and lead them, if you let it go too far, they get too far away from you, or you don't position them well, they start almost acting on their own. It's that feel of they have to now charge because they're so close to the enemy. And so there's this feel that you have a limited amount of control, and in some ways not much control, of your men, which is interesting. And then the battle board is just, to play these abilities is just really, really interesting as to how you have so many different options, and when you have to try to get them by manipulating the dice and then determining what you're going to go for and when, is just really made my brain work hard for this first game. And I liked it. I actually thought, you know what? I don't have a game like this. As much as I have games that are similar to each other, and I realize there are a lot of games out there, and there may be ones that have these sort of mechanics, but I don't currently have a game that operates like this at all. So it was really excellent. I loved it. The other thing that I would just mention, And this could be considered a positive or a negative depending on where you come from and what you like and what you're looking for. But the battle board, as much as I like it, when I go from the perspective of like historical game, it adds an element that almost is like a fantasy element. And what I mean by that is you have like abilities for different factions that are historical factions. And so even though these are all supposed to be just men, and even though like they may come from different countries and have different skill sets, your ability to sort of just add fatigue, like out of nowhere, even though you're not near an opponent, because you've spent it as an ability, it doesn't completely coincide with historical simulation for me. Now, don't take that as a criticism, because I point that out to someone that purely wants to play the game from a historical simulation perspective. I happen to really like it, and I think it's very different, and it's nothing like I've really played before in the way this works. But it has some elements that are not necessarily completely just history. Some of it is very much gamey, and I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just like it's a game within a game, and it has components to it that are not just historical simulation, is all I'm trying to say. Having said that, I really, really enjoyed the game, and I really liked my first pass with Saga, reading through the rules and seeing what it's all about. I do have levies on the way. I do have, through a buddy of mine has placed an order as well with Gripping Beast, and you know him actually, Steve, he comments on the channel quite a bit. And I'm getting heroes and banner barriers because they add abilities, and I'm getting other things to round out my army to make it 6 points and have more versatility. And I'm quite excited to actually play more Saga. So, for those of you that play lots of Saga, if I've got anything wrong or you disagree with my comments, please chime in on the comments below, because I am new with it and I will use that excuse. But I certainly enjoyed it, and I'm really interested to hear how you like Saga and your experiences with it. Okay, take care, everybody.